Imagine a man who spent his entire life in uniform, a man who rose to become a five-star general, the supreme Allied commander, and the architect of the D-Day invasion that broke the back of Nazi Germany. This is a man who understood the machinery of war better than perhaps anyone in human history. Now imagine that same man, at the very end of his 2 terms as President of the United States, standing before a television camera to say goodbye to the nation. But instead of a standard farewell filled with mission-accomplished platitudes, he delivers a chilling, prophetic warning about a growing monster within his own government. He didn't warn us about a foreign invader or a communist uprising. He warned us about ourselves. He warned us about the military-industrial complex. On January 17, 1961, just 3 days before John F. Kennedy would take the oath of office, Dwight D. Eisenhower sat in the Oval Office. The grainy black and white footage of that night captures a man who looks weary but resolute. About halfway through his speech, he uttered the words that would echo through the decades. He said, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." Think about that. The most successful general of the 20th century was telling the American people that their own military and the corporations that supplied it were becoming a threat to the very democracy they were supposed to protect. He saw a future where the pursuit of war would become a permanent business model. And today, we have to look in the mirror and ask, did we listen? To understand why this warning was so shocking, you have to understand the man behind it. Dwight D. Eisenhower, or Ike as everyone called him, wasn't some anti-war radical. He was the ultimate insider. He was a Kansas boy who went to West Point and spent the next several decades climbing the ranks of the U.S. Army. During World War II, he was given the most difficult job in the history of warfare, coordinating the entire Allied effort in Europe. This wasn't just about moving tanks on a map. It was about managing the massive egos of leaders like Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle, while simultaneously overseeing the production and delivery of millions of tons of equipment. When you see the archival footage of D-Day, the Higgins boats hitting the sand, the chaos of Omaha Beach, the sheer scale of the naval armada, you are looking at Eisenhower's vision. But there is a side to this that people often forget. Eisenhower felt the weight of every single life lost under his command. Before the paratroopers dropped into Normandy, he visited them, looking into the eyes of young men he knew many would be dead within 24 hours. He even famously wrote a failure note to be released in case the invasion was pushed back into the sea, taking full responsibility for the disaster. He knew the cost of war wasn't just a line item in a budget. It was paid in blood and the grief of mothers. Because he had seen the absolute worst of total war, Eisenhower emerged from 1945 with a unique perspective. He believed in a strong defense, but he also believed that a nation that spent all its energy and resources on weapons would eventually bankrupt its soul. He had seen how the Nazi war machine had consumed Germany, and he was determined to make sure America didn't fall into the same trap of becoming a garrison state where the military runs everything. He understood that while war was sometimes a necessary evil, it was always a tragedy and a drain on human progress. This deep-seated skepticism of unnecessary conflict would define his entire presidency. When Eisenhower took office in 1953, the world was a terrifying place. The Soviet Union had the atomic bomb, the Korean War was a bloody stalemate, and the Red Scare was sweeping through Washington, D.C. People were building fallout shelters in their backyards, and children were practicing duck-and-cover drills in school. The pressure on Eisenhower to spend more and more on the military was immense. The hawks in the Pentagon and in Congress were constantly screaming that the U.S. was falling behind the Russians. They talked about a bomber gap and later a missile gap, most of which, as it turned out, didn't actually exist. Eisenhower's response was a policy he called the New Look. He realized that if the U.S. tried to maintain a massive standing Army, Navy, and Air Force all at once, the cost would wreck the American economy. His solution was nuclear deterrence. By relying on a smaller but more powerful nuclear arsenal, he could keep the Soviets at bay without spending the country into a hole. He famously said, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed." This wasn't the talk of a warmonger. It was the talk of a man who saw the economic reality of the arms race. Despite his efforts to keep spending under control, the pressure kept building. A new industry was forming. During World War I and World War II, American companies would ramp up production for the war, and then go back to making cars and refrigerators once the peace was signed. But the Cold War changed that. For the first time, America was maintaining a permanent, massive armaments industry in peacetime. Thousands of jobs and billions of dollars were now tied to the production of weapons. Eisenhower saw that this was creating a new and dangerous political force. If your company only makes money when the government buys missiles, you're going to do everything in your power to make sure the government keeps buying missiles, whether they need them or not. By the time 1960 rolled around, Eisenhower was preparing to leave office, and he was deeply worried. He had spent 8 years fighting against the Pentagon's demands for more money, and he felt the tide was turning against him. He started working on his farewell address nearly 2 years before he actually gave it. This wasn't a last-minute thought. It was his final mission. Interestingly, in the early drafts of the speech, he didn't just call it the military-industrial complex, he called it the military-industrial congressional complex. He eventually cut congressional out, likely because he didn't want to pick a fight with the people he still had to work with for a few more months, but the meaning remained the same. In the speech, he explained that the conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry was new in the American experience. He acknowledged that it was necessary because we couldn't just rely on emergency production anymore. But he warned that this new power had the potential to influence every city, every state house, and every office of the federal government. He used the word complex to describe a symbiotic relationship. It's a triangle. The military wants the best weapons, the corporations want the biggest contracts, and the politicians want the jobs and the campaign donations that come from those contracts. They all feed each other, and once that engine starts turning, it is incredibly hard to stop. He also warned about a second threat that people often overlook: the scientific technological elite. He saw that the government was becoming the primary funder of university research. He feared that instead of free-thinking scholars pursuing truth, we would have a situation where the government's checkbook dictated what was studied. This would create a cycle where public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite. Eisenhower was pleading for balance. He wanted a nation that was strong enough to defend itself, but wise enough to know that true security comes from a healthy economy, a free people, and a government that isn't beholden to special interests. Let's break down what the military-industrial complex actually looks like in practice. It starts with the defense contractors, the massive corporations like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Raytheon. These aren't like regular companies that sell to you and me. They have one primary customer: the government. This means their marketing isn't about catchy TV ads. It's about lobbying. They hire former generals and former members of Congress to walk the halls of the Pentagon and the Capitol, whispering in the ears of the people who write the checks. This is often called the revolving door, and it's a central part of the system Eisenhower feared. Then you have the Pentagon influence. The Department of Defense is the largest employer in the world. When you have an organization that big, its primary goal often becomes its own expansion. To get more funding, you have to show that the world is a dangerous place. This creates a natural incentive to exaggerate threats or to suggest that the only solution to any global problem is military force. If all you have is a billion-dollar hammer, every problem starts looking like a nail. This leads to what we now call endless war, or forever wars, where the objective isn't necessarily to win and go home, but to maintain a state of preparedness that justifies a perpetual wartime budget. The final piece of the puzzle is the local impact. Defense contractors are smart. They make sure to build parts of a fighter jet or a submarine in as many different congressional districts as possible. This makes it politically impossible for a member of Congress to vote against a project, even if the military says they don't want it. If a senator votes to cancel an outdated tank program, they are told they are killing jobs in their home state. This turns the defense budget into a massive jobs program, but one that is shielded from the normal scrutiny we give to things like education or healthcare. It becomes a self-sustaining loop where the money flows, the weapons get built, and the influence grows, exactly as Eisenhower predicted. So, 60 years later, what does the evidence look like? If Ike were alive today, he would probably be horrified. The U.S. defense budget is currently pushing toward $1 trillion a year. To put that in perspective, the United States spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined, including China, Russia, and all of our allies. We have hundreds of military bases spread across the globe. Since Eisenhower's speech, we have been involved in major decades-long conflicts in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. In many cases, these wars were fueled by faulty intelligence or shifting goals, but the one constant was the massive profits flowing to defense contractors. Look at the lobbying data. Every year, defense firms spend hundreds of millions of dollars on lobbying and campaign contributions. They have thousands of registered lobbyists in D.C., many of whom are former high-ranking government officials. The revolving door has become a highway. It is now common practice for a four-star general to retire on a Friday and join the board of a major defense contractor on a Monday, earning a salary that dwarfs their military pension. This creates a clear conflict of interest. Are these leaders making decisions based on national security, or are they thinking about their future career prospects in the private sector? We also see the scientific technological elite warning coming true. A huge portion of university research in fields like AI, robotics, and aerospace is funded by the Department of Defense. This isn't to say the research is bad, but it means that the direction of human innovation is being steered toward military applications, rather than solving civilian problems like climate change or disease. We've built a society where it is easier to get funding for a new way to guide a missile than it is to fund a new way to provide clean water. The balance that Eisenhower pleaded for seems to have tilted entirely in one direction. The result is a permanent wartime economy. Even when we aren't officially at war, our economy functions as if we are. We produce weapons that we often don't use, or worse, we sell them to other countries, fueling conflicts elsewhere just to keep the production lines moving. We've seen trillions of dollars spent on wars in the Middle East that many experts believe left the region less stable and the U.S. less secure. Meanwhile, our domestic infrastructure, our roads, bridges, and schools, is often described as crumbling. This is the theft that Eisenhower talked about. We are choosing guns over butter on a scale that would have been unimaginable in 1961. Eisenhower wasn't a prophet in the mystical sense. He was just an honest man who knew how the system worked from the inside. He saw the seeds being planted and tried to tell us what the harvest would look like. He knew that the greatest threat to a democracy isn't always an army marching across the border. Sometimes it's a slow, quiet erosion of our priorities and our pocketbooks by people who claim to be protecting us. He gave us the map, but we chose to ignore the warnings. 60 years later, as we look at the state of our world and our national budget, we have to face the hard questions. Are we really more secure today? Is our democracy still in the hands of the people? Or has it been captured by the unwarranted influence he described? Eisenhower was the last president who could speak with the authority of a general and the perspective of a statesman. He gave us the truth because he had nothing left to lose and nothing more to prove. Now it's your turn to think about this. Given everything that has happened since 1961, the wars, the trillions of dollars, and the massive influence of defense lobbyists, was Eisenhower the last president who truly told America the truth? If you want to learn more about the hidden history that shaped our modern world, click the video on the screen right now.